Okay, so it's recording, right? Okay. All right, so my name is Andrei Logotov, and I'm assistant professor at Moscow State, and I will be moderating our talk tonight. Before we begin, and before I introduce our key participants, I'd like to welcome everyone and a few words about what we are in for today. So the subject of the roundtable is cognitive genre studies, models of reader interactions with text. Roughly a month ago, we did a somewhat similar roundtable on foregrounding or Ostryanenia with a presentation from Willy Van Peer, who talked about studying readers' perception and cognition using quantitative approaches. I'd like to see this event today as one more episode in the same series, aiming to stimulate a discussion around how well-established and somewhat weathered concepts like genre or metaphor or lyric are being recycled, revitalized, and redefined in a new scholarly landscape, which is largely shaped up by cognitive research. Even a cursory reading of relevant literature, including today's abstracts, suggests that genre is something that is not easy to define and is not easy to talk about. It's been with us long enough to become a sort of magic weapon used in the quest for what I'd like to call, I guess, a unified theory of culture. And as any other magic weapon, it has been used both to create impenetrable barriers and to tear them down. To close up my short introduction, I'd like to repeat some of the questions that my colleague, Artem Zubov, whose efforts made today's roundtable happen, put on the call for papers. So number one, what are the functions of genre? How do readers recognize and assimilate genres? And how are those conceptualized in readers' minds? Number two, what connects genre as a socio-cultural construct to genre as a cognitive schema for reception? And finally, what possibilities, advantages, or disadvantages lie ahead for researchers in empirical or theoretical cognitive genre studies? And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers in order of appearance. First is Irina Anatolievna Tarasova. She is a professor and a researcher in cognitive poetics from Saratov State University, Russia. In 2016, she published a book, which is, to my knowledge, the only comprehensive introduction to cognitive poetics available in Russian. Our second participant is Michael Sinding. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right.
That's right.
Sinding. Okay, from Mohawk College, Canada. His research is at the intersections of literature, language, cognition, and culture. As he says on his academia profile, his interests include metaphor, narrative, and genre, especially in the 18th and 20th centuries. My colleague, Artem Zubov, teaches at the same department as I. As I said before, it's him that we ought to thank for today's event. He holds a PhD in literature and works with science fiction, popular literature, genre studies, and media studies. Apart from the people who present their papers, I'm delighted to welcome two more contributors to our discussion today. The first one is Peter Stockwell, who, well, given the subject of today's conversation, barely needs any introduction at all. He's a leading figure in cognitive poetics, literary linguistics, and popular fiction theory. His seminal book on cognitive poetics saw its second edition last year, as far as I know. And he is a professor at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Nottingham. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Sergey Nikolaevich Zenkin, who is a professor at Higher School of Economics and the Russian University for the Humanities. He is widely known for his translations of modern French theory and his groundbreaking work in literary studies. Before I give this Zoom floor to the first speaker, I'd like to remind everyone of the sort of ground rules for tonight. We have 2 hours and a half, all in all. Sorry, I have to turn off my phone. Didn't do that for some reason. So okay, again, we have 2.5 hours. Each speaker will have 20 to 25 minutes. I will be giving a soft reminder 3 or 4 minutes before your time runs out. We'll take 2 short questions after each paper if the speaker does not exceed their time. And everyone is welcome to take part in the general discussion after the 3rd presentation. I encourage everyone to post your questions on the chat. If you're not confident with your English, my colleague, Anna Schwetz, and I will be happy to translate. So, at this point, I guess, without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to Irina Tarasova and her paper on genre and cognition.
Dear colleagues, I am really grateful for being invited for this seminar. Today I am going to talk about genre models in readers' minds. But before I start, I would like to say that it is my first experience of presenting a paper in English, so I beg your indulgence for my English. My research interests are in the sphere of cognitive poetics. From my point of view, cognitive poetics studies architecture of mental forms of an author and a reader. Accordingly, I distinguish between cognitive poetics from the author's perspective and cognitive poetics from the reader's one. In my previous work, I have proposed a model of the author's conceptual sphere as a mental basis of a poetic individual style. Now, my research interests have shifted toward the reader's mind. I think it would be very interesting and useful to reconstruct forms of representation of genres in the mind of the reader. This line of research borders on receptive aesthetics on the one hand and on the pragmatic theory and sociology of the genre on the other. Genres don't exist regardless of their perception. They should be embodied in the reader's mind. The purpose of cognitive genre study is to consider genre as a form of mental representation. What is mental representation? It is usually defined as a unit of representation of the real or a fictional world in the mind of a person. There are several types of mental representations. A picture, a spatial scheme, a combination of sensory and emotional impression, a categorical interpretation. Please look at the slide that represents three series of mental representation. Let's consider the dual coding theory. Based on it, the main type of representation are image-bearing and propositional, that a distinctive feature, logical. These two codes are likely to represent genres in the mind of the reader. The propositional representations of the genre are more popular in cognitive studies. Propositions are a part of schemes, scripts, frames, which are considered as varieties of cognitive models, including George Lakoff's idealized cognitive models that you can see in the following slide. So, Michael Sinding used some of these models in his article After Definitions, Genre, Categories, and Cognitive Science. He suggests that a genre is presented in the mind of the reader in the form
У меня двух наушников нет, мне сейчас надо решить как.
The speech genre model proposed by Tatiana Shmilova, please look at the next slide, is essentially a frame, the unit of knowledge organized around a genre concept containing data on its essential properties. This is a questionnaire presented to a genre and includes its main slots. I used the parameters of this questionnaire to compose a multiple choice question and presented it to my students. And now I turn to the empirical part of my paper. I conducted the pilot phase of the experiment with two groups of recipients. The first group are the future teachers of primary and preschool education, about 90 recipients. I suppose they can be attributed to ordinary readers. They study the course of children's literature, but they are not philologists. They have skills on text analysis at the elementary level. They were asked to answer the question, how do you identify genre of a book? Choose an answer from the list or add your own. You can see the most frequent answers on the next slide. The number of responses is given in brackets. Typically, recipients choose multiple responses by theme, content, by the author's surname. Of course, this is not an image of the author, but correlate with by image of the heroes. I added this parameter to Shmilova's questionnaire, taking into account the specific nature of the literary genres, by linguistic features, and by time setting. Thus, some parameters of Shmilova's model are relevant for readers when they identify a genre. The question is whether it is possible to describe mental representation of a genre in the mind of a reader by the cluster model. If we assume a semantic format for storing information, then it can be so. And I think that a cluster is a less rigidly organized structure of features than a frame. Let's suppose that a representation of a genre in the reader's mind can be based on the cluster model, which suggests that readers define a number of features by which they identify the genre. So, answering the question, what features help you identify a piece of writing as a fantasy genre? The second group of recipients, about 120 pupils and students aged from 10 to 19, named 7 genre-forming features, including the following. Please look at the slide. An unrealistic and unusual plot, magic and fictional creatures, supernatural abilities of heroes, presence of an alternative separate universe, and others. I admit that an increase in the number of recipients will lead to an increase in the number of features, but in any case, it is unlikely that these features can be covered with a certain invariant. But what about imaginative representations? The imaginative way of information encoding suggests that belonging a particular work to a particular genre is determined in the reader's mind by its similarity with the typical genre exemplar, a prototype. The number of such prototypes is not very large. As a rule, this status is acquired by works that are included in the school literary canon. So, when asked about a typical work of their favorite genre, almost half of the respondents, future teachers of primary preschool education, named. Look at the slide. The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, War and Peace by Tolstoy, Eugene Onegin by Pushkin is the best exemplar for the novel. So, as we can see, there are two approaches for encoding genre information. The first one is through genre features, and the second one through a genre prototype, which is in a certain degree coincides with an image. It is clear that in the reader's mind, genre classes are not formation with rigid boundaries. Rather, they are more likely to be built on the principle of family resemblance, as suggested by Fisher law. It means that the cognitive model of a genre in the mind of a reader has certain features of a field. It has a core and a periphery, and genre prototypes are at the core of the field. Genre awareness of reader as a whole has a field structure. Some genres are, at its core, they are well recognizable, others are peripheral. So, answering the question, what genres of literature do you know? The student mentioned about 60 genres. Please look at the next slide. The novel is on the top of the list. Student also named a story, short story, fantasy, detective story, and so on. In general, narrative genres are mentioned much more often than lyrical and dramatic ones. The question, what genre do you prefer to read, allows us to correlate abstract knowledge of genres and real reading experience. The list of favorite genres is short. It is 5 times shorter than the list of the mentioned genres, which readers knew theoretically. Students know about 60 genres, but they actively interact with only 12, the novel, the fantasy, the detective story, and so on. Look at the next slide, please. There are narrative genres again. One respondent expressly says, I prefer epic genres. Does this mean that epic or narrative genres are at the hardcore of genre awareness of the modern reader? On the other hand, the genre model itself has the outlines of a field. Its genre core may include some dominant features of a genre, or the scheme of the typical plot, or an imaginative representation of the prototypes of the genre. Core genres can replace peripheral genres that do not have clear representation in the mind of a reader. For example, in theory, students know that there are genres of parable, prosaic fable, or poem and prose. But when asked to identify the genre of an unfamiliar text of these genre types, they identify it as a short story. To find out how the genre is presented in the mind of a reader, we should ask the reader about it. But it is still not very clear what questions a reader should be asked for the reconstruction of a genre mental representation in his or her mind. I have tried to adapt the Chandler's genre analysis questionnaire for this purpose. Please look at the next slide. But firstly, it is too difficult for my ordinary, not sophisticated readers, and they make mistakes already at the first step when identify the genre. Secondly, it is a good guide to genre analysis, but regretfully, this questionnaire does not allow us to establish how a genre is represented in the mind of a reader. What is its mental representation? Conducting cognitive genre research requires the development of a special questionnaire that take into account the level of the ordinary, naive reader who is not a philologist. So the main ideas of my paper are as follows. Look at the slide, please. The purpose of cognitive genre study is to consider genre as a form of mental representation. When building a genre model in the reader's mind, it is necessary to take into account both formats to encoding information, propositional and imaginative. The cognitive model of a genre in the mind of the reader has certain features of a field. The outlines of the field have both genre awareness as a whole and a model of each genre separately. To find out how genres are presented in the mind of the reader, we have to ask them about it. When developing questionnaire, we must target not only the level of a sophisticated reader, but also on the capabilities of the ordinary one. The content of this questionnaire is considered to be debatable. Thank you for your attention. I am happy to answer your question. I would be grateful if you ask your question in Russian. Your question in English will be translated like my answers, I hope.
All right, Irina, thank you very much for your presentation. Everybody is welcome to ask their questions. I see that Sergey Zenkin has turned on his mic.
Да, спасибо. У меня очень частный вопрос. Что вы имели в виду, когда называли в числе жанровых признаков time setting?
Что именно?
Что вы имели в виду, когда называли в числе жанровых признаков time setting?
Yeah, so the question is, what did you mean when you listed time setting as a parameter, as a
время – это временной параметр, да, время, которое изображено в произведении. Некоторые из читателей сказали, что они учитывают этот признак при определении жанра. Ну, в частности, были ответы, например, про исторический роман. Я думаю, что это имелось в виду.
So this is the time that is depicted in the work of literature. Это длительность времени или это указание на какое-то время?
Указание на какое-то время, я думаю.
It's a reference to a specific time period within the work, the literary work. Thank you. I see a hand from Anna Murashova, please.
Добрый день, спасибо за доклад. Подскажите, пожалуйста, на слайд, где вы рассказывали про то, что просили респондентов назвать образцы жанров. А образцы каких жанров?
So in your slide, when you said that you asked the participants of your survey to name examples of particular genres, so what genres?
Им было предложено назвать свой любимый жанр, и вторым в этом же пункте второй вопрос был, какое произведение они считают образцом, в кавычках, образцом этого жанра. Поэтому в зависимости от того, какой жанр выбирал респондент, он приводил образец именно этого жанра. Но поскольку больше половины назвали роман, то получилось, что в основном вот такую выборку более-менее обширную можно сделать по типичным романам, по прототипам романного жанра. Просто потому, что большинство читателей называют роман своим любимым жанром.
Okay, so the participants were asked two questions. The first one about their favorite genre, and the second one, if they named a certain genre as favorite, they were asked about a prototype or a good example of the genre. So most of the participants named novel as their favorite genre. Therefore, we have a lot of examples or prototypes of novels. There is a question from Peter Stockwell. I will read it for everyone. I was very interested in the difference between the number of genres that young people knew compared with the number of genres that they actively engaged with. This disparity points to the prototypically of genre itself. Prototypicity of genre itself, perhaps? Is there a pattern?
Sorry, that's my spelling. Sorry. Yeah, prototypicality. So
prototypicality. Okay, I didn't know that one already.
Typing too fast.
Yeah. Okay. To the prototypicality of genre itself, is there a pattern of those genres that were most familiar? Ирина, вы понимаете вопрос?
Я просто плохо слышу довольно-таки, поэтому еще раз пару.
Аня, вы могли бы перевести?
Да, конечно. Мне бы было, мое внимание привлекло вот это различие в количестве жанров, которые молодые люди знали, по сравнению с количеством жанров, с которыми они активно взаимодействовали. Вот это противоречие указывает нам на вот эту прототипичность категории жанра самой по себе. Существует ли паттерн этих жанров, существует ли паттерн наиболее известных жанров? Я бы так это перевела.
А где он должен существовать? В исследованиях теоретических?
Если у жанров, которые наиболее популярны, что-то общее.
Да.
Я могу сделать выводы только на основании вот своей экспериментальной работы, что вот эти 12, получилось, что 12 жанров, они наиболее популярны у современных, у молодых читателей. Первая тройка – это роман, это детектив и фэнтези. И, ну, остальные жанры, там 2-3 упоминания. Но я не знаю, есть ли работы такого плана теоретические, которые, может быть, бы сделали проекцию на более большую выборку, потому что все-таки я опросила небольшое, я считаю, количество, около 90 человек. Возможно, что что-то изменится, но то, что роман на первом месте стоит, мне кажется, это очевидно, просто очень большое количество ответов. Вот,
а что-то объединяет?
Тройка, да, роман, детектив и фэнтези.
А что-то эти три жанра самых популярных объединяет? Я думаю, в этом суть вопроса Питера.
Ну, я вот склоняюсь к тому, что все-таки это нарративные жанры. То есть стихотворение не назвал фактически никто. И там поэма, по-моему, встречалась, и все.
All in all, well, the scope of the research was relatively limited because there were only 90 people who took part in the survey. So that's point one. Point two, as far as I understood, is that, well, answering the question of what is the pattern among the most popular genres was not itself a goal within the project. Well, the third point, that most of the respondents, they started answering those questions with naming the narrative genres, such as novel or fantasy or, you know, science fiction was the third one perhaps. And almost none of them mentioned poetry, which we actually saw on the slide. All right, yeah, good. Anybody else have one more question for Irina? Okay, Michael Sinding, very interesting. Okay, just a point. Could you translate that?
Да, конечно, сейчас я переведу. Очень интересно, что прототипические тексты определенных жанров – это те тексты, которые преподаются в школе. Так, сейчас момент. Это как раз-таки проявляет взаимосвязь между социокультурным и когнитивным, что является одной из главных тем нашего круглого стола. Это еще не все. И вопрос состоит в следующем. Являются ли эти прототипические тексты теми текстами, не являются ли эти прототипические текстами теми текстами, которые мы изучаем в школе? Все.
Вопрос другой. Если называют ли... Немножко другой вопрос. Называли ли опрашиваемые какие-то тексты, которые не преподавали в школе?
Да, называли. Это произведение не русской литературы, скажем так. Это были «Унесенные ветром» и «Pride and Prejudice». Остин и... Я подозреваю, что просто фильмы на них произвели большое впечатление. Почему-то мне так кажется.
All right, there is perhaps some impact on the side of cinema, because they did name a couple of literary works that were outside the school canon and were actually outside the Russian canon as well. So to the movies, those works, not the works themselves. Okay, we have to wrap up at this point, and let me see my notes. Well, thank you again, Irina Anatolievna. And now we have, I would like to give the floor to Michael Sinding. And as a quick reminder, 20 to 25 minutes. There you go. I will unmute you myself. Yeah, you can talk now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much to Artem and other speakers and guests joining us today for the roundtable. I'll approach our topic by analyzing genre mixture in terms of the cognitive theory of conceptual blending. And to briefly outline, I'll highlight the importance of genre mixture in literature and tragicomedy as a form of genre mixture, and then discuss cognitive approaches to these topics. I'll be glancing at a previous method I've used and then turn to a new approach. I'll examine Shakespeare's Winter's Tale as a tragicomedy, just briefly touching on the background of generic experiment and debate at the time, and then developing an overview of the whole genre structure of the text based on a scene-by-scene analysis, and then look closely at a couple of scenes that achieve that structure and consider how that genre analysis can help explain the effects that those scenes have. So this is the models of reader interaction with the text part. In line with some current thinking, I'm using maybe excessive uses of visualization because I think they can offer us insights into that modeling that words can't always offer. So genre mixture is a central process in literary creativity and literary history. Many texts do have just one genre, and that's fine. But especially in literature, many texts are mosaics of many genres, and I hope it will in time become standard to discuss not just the genre of a text, but rather its genre structure, the specific ways it combines genres into a new whole. And I think we can nod to Bakhtin and Tynyanov and other Russian thinkers for pioneering the understanding of genre dynamics that we have now. Now, tragicomedy is one of the most important forms of genre mixture, and some say it's the default mode for literature now. But there were notable historical shifts in the Renaissance and in modernism. I'm interested in what we can gain for understanding genre emotion in these texts by analyzing those tragicomic mixtures in terms of blending. So adapting blending theory. Blending theory sees conceptualizations in terms of networks of mental spaces, that is, activations of scene-like concepts structured by frames and models that get linked by mappings and evolved by completion, which is filling in content from background knowledge, and elaboration, which is further simulations of scenes. So blending analyses seek to specify these elements and processes and how they generate emergent structure. That is new structure that's not part of the input spaces. So here's a standard diagram where we have your two input spaces. The generic space above holds shared structure of the inputs, and the blend holds new elements and relations in the new construction. Now, adapting this for blending theory or for genre mixtures, in the past, I've tried to do this in outline, where the input spaces are the contributing genres, and the story world of the text is an emergent structure, which has its own peculiar genre structure, and that in turn may constitute a new emergent genre as well. So you start from genre schemas and try to show how genre blending links levels of linguistic style, the character and plot schema, and even cultural history. So as a quick example, a study of Don Quixote started out with schemas for narrative fiction input genres, which included parameters like characters, settings, story events, form, and style. You try to specify those at the right level of detail for each of your input genres, and then show how they combine by mappings and projections to create a new genre frame. And that frame goes on to structure a string of specific scenes, as well as the overall story world. And that extends down even to the level of word creativity. So this time I'm trying to do something a little different, trying to capture the whole genre structure of a single text and to see how that underlies its peculiar quirks and powers. So I'm exploring how Shakespeare creates emergent forms of tragicomedy, offering new forms of emotion and visions of the world. Right, so turning to The Winter's Tale. A bit of background. Many Renaissance writers were highly conscious of genre and engaged in fascinating generic experimentation. There was Sidney's defense of poesy, which argued for the classical unities of genre, unity of time, place, action, and tone. And against this, John Fletcher promotes tragicomedy in the prologue to his play, The Faithful Shepherdess, which itself is an adaptation of Il Pastor Fido, a play by Giambattista Guarini. And Guarini analyzed tragicomedy far more extensively in his own treatise, which itself is would be worth a roundtable alone. So Shakespeare may have known Guarini, and he certainly knew Fletcher because they collaborated. Now, 4 of Shakespeare's late plays, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, Pericles, and The Tempest, are regarded as a distinctive group in terms of plot, language, tone, and more. And they're often labeled as tragicomedies or romances or some combination of terms. The Winter's Tale may be the most experimental and mixed of them. There's a clearly tragic first part, followed by a clearly comic second part. So I'm going to be eventually focusing on these 2 decisive and celebrated sequences. The one scene that ends the tragedy and therefore marks the turning point of the comedy, and the 2 scenes that end the comedy and therefore fulfill the tragicomic structure. And both of these are noted for being strange and jarring and powerful. So first, we need a brief synopsis just to keep ourselves on the same page. So the first part of the play, the wintry part, the tragedy of Leontes, king of Sicily, who loses everything, his son Mamilius, newborn daughter Perdita, wife Hermione, closest friend Polixenes, king of Bohemia, due to a fit of jealous vengeance for an imagined affair between Hermione and Polixenes. Now the second part is the comic romance of how, after 16 years of Leontes' faithful penitents, all but Mamilius are miraculously restored and reconciled. So in a little bit more depth, during a visit, Leontes suddenly becomes convinced that Polixenes is father of his children and orders his advisor Camillo to kill him. Camillo instead warns Polixenes and they flee. Leontes takes this as proof of guilt and imprisons Queen Hermione to await trial. Under this strain, the queen gives birth prematurely and her lady, Paulina, defies and scolds Leontes, giving him the child. The king then orders Paulina's husband, Antigonus, first to burn the child and then to leave it exposed in the desert. Hermione defends herself eloquently at the trial, and she's backed up by an oracle, but Leontes rejects all this. Just then, Mamilius is reported dead, and Hermione collapses, apparently also dead. Leontes sees his error and vows to atone. In the final scene of the tragic part, Antigonus is leaving the baby named Perdita in a desert on the seacoast of Bohemia, and he's then killed by a bear and his ship lost in a storm. The famous exit pursued by a bear scene. 2 comical shepherds appear and rescue Perdita. So there's then an interval of 16 years. And the comic part begins. So we meet Perdita and her husband-to-be Florizel, who is the son of Polixenes, at a sheep shearing festival. There's some comic relief from Autolycus, who is a hawker of ballads. Polixenes and Camillo are curious about the upcoming wedding, and so they attend the feast, but in disguise. A fight breaks out where Polixenes rejects Florizel for choosing the poor shepherdess. Camillo helps the 2 visit Leontes to win Polixenes' blessing. Polixenes still resists, but Perdita's royal identity is proven by the tokens that her shepherd family found with her. The joyous reunion of all is reported, and the shepherds and Autolycus are rewarded. Finally, with the oracle about Perdita fulfilled, Paulina dramatically reveals that the supposed statue of Hermione in her chapel is in fact the queen herself. So Hermione reunites with husband and daughter, and Leontes arranges for Camilla to marry Paulina. So I hope that is a brief but detailed enough sense of what's going on. Right. So describe the method in progress and its results. This is a little survey of what I've tried to do. It's fairly systematic, but not morbidly so. I think it still involves a lot of literary intuition. Start by identifying and briefly sketching all known input genres, mention some prototype texts, then try to map the field of input genres in terms of those parameters of height and emotional mood. We'll see what that looks like in a moment. And then the main work in this is going through each scene, summarizing it, and linking the main elements of each scene with one or more genres. With that in hand, you can create a table to give a complete overview of all genres in each scene in the order of appearance. And then you can revise the table to indicate the relative intensity of each genre in the scene, and we'll see that. We've used bars like sort of like volume bars to indicate the intensity of the genre in each scene. And then revise again to indicate the relative dramatic importance of each scene in terms of font size. So the larger size columns will indicate more important dramatic scenes. All right. And with that in hand, this is a little more experimental. You can try to trace those key scenes through the map of genres that you created earlier on. So this is simplistic in some ways, and it certainly is informed by intuition, but it does give, I think, a useful picture of the overall genre structure of the text, which genres are used and how intensely and important. So there are other ways of doing this, of course. Now, the main input genres are prose romance. The main source text for the play is Robert Greene's tragic Pandolfo, and Shakespeare alters that in key ways. There are tragedy and comedy generally. These were familiar dramatic categories at the time, based on Greek and Roman plays, of course, and more recent ones. These, I would say, are largely a function of moods created by types of character and situation, and also resolutions, which may be bad or good, but those factors drive much else in the plot. There is also pastoral, the stories of shepherds celebrating life in nature, going back to Theocritus and the Greeks, but also importantly updated by recent writers like Sidney, Arcadia and Spencer and others. There is picaresque, which mixes pastoral with urban comedy and parody. And so we get the more roguish, humorous aspects of the play, particularly in the character of Autolycus. And this comes from what are called coney catching pamphlets, such as, again, Robert Greene's A Notable Discovery of Cozenage. There's also the Mask, which are elaborate court spectacles. Contemporaries of Shakespeare's like Johnson and Campion staged these remarkable scenes involving statues and bears, which seem to reappear in The Winter's Tale. There's also myth, especially Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Pygmalion, Niobe, and Proserpina will become important in this play. Fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty, which have parallels with legends and saints' lives. Dramatic romances, the earlier English ones, which were disparaged as moldy tales at the time, such as Musidorus and The Rare Triumphs of Love and Fortune. And finally, there are miracle and mystery plays of the Middle Ages, such as the Digby Mary Magdalene play, which presents stories of saints and divine lives. So if we try to map this field of genres, we can come up with something like this, where one axis is defined in terms of genre height. That's sort of the moral and emotional quality of the genre. And the other axis is defined in terms of positive and negative moods. Of course, you have tragedy on the negative end and comedy on the opposite end. Romance and the other genres are mostly in the middle. Some of them fall more towards comedy, but the vertical axis contrasts the sort of traditionally higher genres like myth and romance with the traditionally lower ones like picaresque. Come back to that. Now, next, there's the process of mapping genres to each scene and sequence. So, of course, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we can look quickly at an example. scene, Act 3, Scene 3 is the end of the tragic first part. And again, this is the exit pursued by a bear scene. And so what we've got is a description of what actually happens in the scene. And then the next stage is associating those parts with genres. So we can see, for example, that there is tragedy in this because the child is being abandoned in the desert to storm and beasts. There is a nemesis quality because Antigonus is suffering a kind of nemesis or wrath of nature as he gets eaten by a bear and the ship is wrecked by a storm. There are romance qualities in the marvelous story of the lost royal child, a vision of the dead Hermione that Antigonus has before he dies. There's the shipwreck, the wild hunt, the bear and the romance of Musidorus. And very importantly, there's the comic counterpoint where it's those comic pastoral rustic characters who report what's happening in this scene, and they make that tragic romance events that conclude this first part sound rather ridiculous, and yet they also save the child, which adds to the sense that we're turning into a comic world. And there's a sort of minor allusion to mask as well. So we do this for every scene in the play. There it is. And then start trying to tabulate. And this is the first simple table where you simply ask how tragic or how comic is each scene. Sometimes it's ambiguous, so I've got question marks there. In the first scene, for example, you don't really know what's going on, what's going to happen. But it's potentially tragic and potentially comic. Making things more complex, you work in all of the known genres of the play, and then go through it scene by scene again and identify which uses which genres. One obvious point is that the play adds more genres as it goes on, so it becomes more generically complex from beginning to end. But with this, you can begin to see how the genres balance out and how an individual scene is more or less complex than another one. Once we add the intensity of these genres, then we have a little more information. We can notice that tragedy, for example, is very loud, so to speak, in Act 1, Scene 2, because that's where the tragedy really begins and things start to fall apart. And then in Act 3, Scene 2, we can see that tragedy is increased in volume again, but we've also got a kind of counterpoint of myth, which is becoming louder and balancing that out. That's because this is the scene of Hermione's trial, but there are oracles who return to support Hermione's side. And so you get a little bit more information from this stage of the tabulation. And finally, I've altered the table again to indicate the dramatic importance of the scene. So those higher rows are those that are most important in the actual unfolding of the events of the play. Act 1, Scene 2 is when, again, the tragedy precipitates and things really start to go downhill. 3.2 is that trial of Hermione, where the tragic events sort of culminate. Act 4, Scene 4 is where things really turn around and represent the comic world in the second part of the play, and you get the sheep shearing festival with pastoral elements and picaresque elements, and nonetheless still a conflict with the tragic characters. And finally, of course, the very last scene, 5.3, has very strong elements of some new genres that make it very distinctive, and the tragedy at that point is finally pushed out of the picture. So next stage, you can try to generalize about ways of integrating tragedy and comedy, and this particular picture is just an attempt to point out where these key structural scenes, roughly where they land in this genre map of the play. It's not, none of this is very satisfactory, but it does give a sense that the focus of where the genres are moves over the course of the play. This is a different version of the same map, which is a little more interesting because it shows how these key scenes connect their genres. This is that, again, the trial of Hermione scene. And 4.4 again is the sheep shearing festival, which combines myth and pastoral, tragedy and comedy, and picaresque and mask in certain ways. And then 5.3 again is the final scene, which is really focuses up into that northeast quadrant, where you get the much more positive moods and the much more traditionally high morally and high emotional genres. So again, an attempt at visualization. All right, so with this kind of overview, we can generalize about ways of integrating tragedy and comedy. Genre expectations are disrupted by intrusions of alien genre elements into the overall mood. So we're kept somewhat off balance and begin to expect the unexpected. In particular, the tragic part includes some comic elements and vice versa to forecast the turn to comic moments that will complete the narrative. And we note that characters and roles are important. Various literary elements can carry genre features, but one very common carrier is the character type, because they bring along genre moods with them, ways of acting, emotions, values, attitudes, and styles. Hence, comic characters can intrude on tragic scenes, modulating and even inverting their trajectories and vice versa. Now, emotion researchers distinguish between foreground emotions, which are evaluations of action and situation, and background emotions or general moods, which are, as one put it, the emotion system's equivalent of attention. And similarly, characters may be primary or secondary, and they may be in the foreground or background of scenes. And this dynamic allows one to rearrange character frames to modulate and blend and reframe emotion and perspective. So looking at the details of some key scenes, I'll try to show how we can develop this in terms of modulation of genre elements. A key thread of character type and action ties the two closing parts together, I think. And it's most importantly, it's Paulina as a defender of Hermione takes on a shrew or scold type of role or character type in her disputes with King Leontes. And Joan Hartwig pointed this out back in 1970. So this is a character with a long pedigree in comic genres. Noah's wife is said to be a scold, according to some mystery plays, and there's Chaucer's Wife of Bath and many others. So for example, Paulina says to the king as he denies his child, "It is yours, and so like you, 'tis the worst." Now this sort of thing, this banter between Paulina and the king, generates incipient comedy in the generally tragic persecution of the innocent queen. So it modulates the tone and offers some surprising hope. And yet it also drives some of the tragic action, as when Leontes commands Antigonus to burn the baby, "Go take it to the fire, for thou setst on thy wife." Antigonus is forced to beg for its life, yet is killed when he follows the somewhat milder command to merely expose it in the desert. So Paulina's wrath drives Antigonus into Leontes' wrath, which then drives him into the wrath of Storm and Bear. So this looks like the tragic end of everything until two shepherds burst onto the scene and change it utterly. The old shepherd rescues the baby, and his son reframes the chaotic deaths of Antigonus and crew that he witnesses in such chaotic and schizophrenic fashion that it becomes grotesquely comic in some of those lines. "I would you could see how it chafes, how it rages, how it takes up the shore, but that's not the point. Or the most piteous cry of the poor souls. Now the ship boring the moon with her mainmast," and so on. And then for the land service, to make an end of the ship, but first, and so on. So as these secondary characters take over the foreground, while the background primary characters are destroyed, they break the fall of the tragic mood, so to speak. They deflate it and absorb it into their own perspectives and bounce it into a potentially hopeful future. So they quickly wipe clean the emotional slate, and now we expect more of the unexpected. And this brings us into the comic part. So looking now at the resolution of the comic part of the play. First, again, recall that Paulina repents her scolding at the tragic climax when Leontes sees his fault after Mamilius has died. But then he demands more abuse, and she becomes a kind of scourging confessor to him. In the second part, she's still scolding him 16 years later. even though penitent Leontes and others have asked her to desist or at least dial it down. Now, Act 5, Scene 2 parallels the closing of the tragic part, and it's renowned for presenting the penultimate recognitions and reunions via the reports of three rather uneloquent gentlemen. So these reports are said to deliberately mute the reunion, and I'd suggest they also self-consciously make a show of these kind of explosions of paradoxical tragicomic emotion in order to release that excess melodramatic energy and prepare for the more solemn next and final scene.
Now, Michael,
Someone says,
I'm very sorry to interject. We have about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll jump to the next and final scene. So here, Paulina renounces her scolding early on. She becomes instead a masked director, agent of the final revelation, still in the foreground, but with a new mood. She'll move into the background when she finally brings Hermione to life, shifting the mood of myth and miracle to the fore. So comedy provides the general literal story world situation frame, where all characters are gathered and reconciled in festivity. But the final piece of the puzzle is missing. Hermione's prosecution and death is the center of the tragedy of the first part, and the story won't be complete unless that tragedy is absorbed. Hermione has to return, and she has to do it right, and Shakespeare finds patterns of genre that converge in the right way. The literal situation proposed is pretty far-fetched, and Paulina and Shakespeare show they recognize this, say that it would be hooted at like an old tale. So the key here, I think, is the mapping between different genre world means for achieving this plot turn of getting Hermione back, and then framing those means as metaphors for the comic resolution. Sleep to waking, stone to flesh, death to life, spring. So more specifically, there is the martyr's resurrection or ascension that you would get from sacred genres alluded to, like scripture, saints' lives, and those miracle mystery plays. There is the return from the dead and stone turning to flesh that you get in myth, especially Ovid. There's waking from a magic sleep spell that you get in the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. And then the magic of art itself, emulating life and vivifying life in those allusions to other art genres, such as music, sculpture, and painting. So the genres carry conflicting story world assumptions, and this conflict pushes concerns with story world ontology into the attentional background while mapping these event images to one another to focus attention on the emotional power of symbol and mood. That is, we remain within comedy's world rules, but they're loosened too, to the effect of what we see. These symbolic event images with their sense of metaphor and dramatic poetic spectacle is foregrounded, and this intensifies that sacred romance mood. Last word will just be that Hermione's return is framed in terms of the opening comic mood, evoking the couple's courtship and marriage. The statue's lifelikeness reminds Leontes of his first wooing. The tragic turn of jealous madness began shortly after, when he recalled the same period with bitter resentment. Now when Hermione descends, Paulina tells him not to shun her, echoing her earlier hesitation. When she was young, you wooed her. Now in age has she become the suitor. We might say this closing reversal of the comic opening forgives or accepts atonement for that moment of tragic fall. So I hope this helps make sense of how the integration of clashing emotional high and low points marked by phrases like exit pursued by a bear is different from that as be stone no more, and break some new ground of genre plot and feeling and framing and attitude. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. And we do have some time for some questions at this point. Well, we do have a question from Peter on the chat, but I would like to a little bit monopolize the privilege of a moderator. And if you don't mind, ask one of mine. So could you flip back a few slides? I'll tell you when to stop. I think it was the first slide that was called blending generic. Oh, yeah. Was too fast. Okay, anyway, well, at some point, I noticed that in your analysis, when you talked about the tragic part of the play, when you talked about an input from a certain genre or from a certain genre tradition, you relied more on allusions to specific texts. Well, I have 2 points here. First of all, using an allusion does not necessarily call for the concept of genre, in my understanding. You can just talk about connections between 2 texts, right? Not talk about genre at all, maybe, okay? And my second question is, the text that is being alluded to can itself be subjected to the same analysis, which will almost inevitably reveal it as a combination of other genres / allusions / inputs. So is there an end to this chain or to this dynamic? Should there be an end? So this is a question that I wanted to ask you.
Right. Yeah, well, the question of allusion or intertextuality versus genre connection is a very interesting and tricky one. And I think you really have to go on a case-by-case basis and say, is this just a passing allusion, or is it something that brings more of the weight of the genre into the scene? I did mention in one scene, there's a bear in the one scene. And there's a bear in one of Johnson's masks, I think. So even if Shakespeare knew that mask, the bear is not necessarily playing the sort of role in this scene as it was in Mask. So you have to make those kinds of judgments. And that's why I would make a note of that as I was doing the summary, but I also put a question mark over it. So this is a possible allusion to another genre, and an allusion to a genre may develop into something more significant later on. But in that case, in that particular scene, I would say it was an allusion rather than any kind of significant genre connection. But Mask does come into the play more importantly later on. And as to the sort of intertextual chain of this leads us back to that and what we do from there, I think you can do this sort of genre analysis with most complex texts. Some literary genres simply are the genre that they are, and they have one genre, and that's fine, and they do it well. But it's such a common process, and especially in efforts at pushing literary creativity, to bring in another genre or several other genres in some way, that it's worth looking out for. And I would hope it would become normal, as I said, to think about not just the genre of a text or a collection of genres for a text, but think about how it uses genres and what its blend of genres is, what genre structure is.
All right, thank you very much. And there is a question from Peter Stockwell on the chat. I love this multi-dimensional model, Michael. How did you calibrate the emotional intensity of each scene? The answer, intuition, is fine with me. So is the answer intuition?
It is not entirely intuition in the sense that it's just made up or personal. I mean, it's a matter of studying the text over and over and trying to make as careful a judgment as possible about what role each contributing genre plays in each particular scene. So it is, it's not, I don't think I could say it's objective. I mean, for all I know, there may be ways of making it more objective, but it's a matter of being aware of the existing genres that contribute and trying to get as clear a sense as possible as what genre is most important in the scene and what genre is next most important and how they're working together in a given scene. So you have to be aware of the genres that are in play and live with the scenes, as thoroughly as you can.
But on the numerical level, do the inputs from different genres add up to 100%? Or? I
don't know. Well, in terms of the tables,
just pure bold numbers. So how does it work?
Yeah. Well, I would guess that the simple answer would be that the text must be the sum of all its genres, so they must add up to 100%. Probably more interesting, in terms of the levels of intensity, this was not meant to add up to anything in particular. So that was just a sense of how important and how emotionally powerful a certain genre was at a certain time. So in scene 3-2 is the trial scene with Hermione. It's very emotionally powerful because it's this conflict between innocent Hermione defending herself and ruthless Leontes who won't believe her. And then this is when everything starts to fall apart. Mamilius dies, Hermione collapses, Leontes realizes what he's done. So that's simply in terms of the
it looks
emotional
like more like grading on a scale in a certain terms. Yeah. I see that Artem has raised a hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, excuse me, but there was another question to Michael. It's in his chat. It's a private question, I guess. So I would just ask to pay his attention to the question. So Michael, can you see the question in the chat?
Yeah, I can see. Can see the question from Suna Auken and Andrei Logotov and Lena Rabina. I'm not sure oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, we can probably, so Suna, well, she has a very interesting question we can get back to.
Okay.
The general discussion, because this will also bring us back to the...
Yeah, may I just ask
I think I've got
a methodological question? Yes, so Michael, first of all, thank you very much for being here and giving this very interesting presentation. I guess, my question is methodological. I was just wondering, how do you identify genres in The Winter's Tale? Or what kind of genres do you identify in The Winter's Tale? What I mean is that do you identify genres that are objectively in the text, or are you trying to identify genres from the perspective of Shakespeare's contemporaries, which also poses specific problems? Or maybe you identify, what kind of genres are you seeing in the text? Is it like objective genres or historical genres, or what is it?
I was trying to stick as closely as possible to genres that would have been recognized in Shakespeare's time. So the Mask was well known, for example. Pastoral was well known. Dramatic categories of tragedy and comedy, those were given as parts of the titles of plays. Same goes for romance. Well, at the same time, in some of the analysis, especially the way that you can group or map genres, you end up realizing that some genres kind of go together more easily than others. And they can be grouped according to different principles. So you could say, what are the dramatic genres here? Okay, well, tragedy, comedy. There are romantic dramas. Mask is dramatic. And the miracle and mystery plays are dramas as well. So there's one grouping. But you can also group them more in terms of emotional qualities. So picaresque, for example, is very much opposed to the more solemn and elevated emotions of miracle and mystery and myth. So that feeds into the analysis when you understand that the say myth and miracle may overlap with each other much more easily than say myth and picaresque. So I tried to begin at least with the existing scholarship on Shakespeare genres. in the terms that would have been known in his time. But when it came to the analysis part, then it was sort of more flexible in trying to map them out and understand how they were connecting.
So can we say in this connection that the model that you present to us today is sort of a reconstruction of how Shakespeare's contemporaries could have possibly reacted emotionally to this play? So it's more a historical reconstruction.
It is an attempt at that, although it was based very much on my own responses to the play, but also on reading of some of the history of criticism of the play. Mm-hmm. So we know, for example, that the early audiences were much more excited about the pastoral parts of the play, whereas modern audiences have much more a sense of identification with the earlier tragic parts of the play. You could psychoanalyze Leontes all day long. So we know there are those historical shifts. So it attempts to capture something that could plausibly have happened in the minds of Shakespeare's contemporaries, but I have to confess it is largely based on my own experience of the play and my own reading about the criticism of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There's
a question from
Artem, can we take one more question at this point?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Tatiana.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating analysis. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the nature of generic emotion. I understand that it's a genre-specific emotion. How easy or how difficult it is to differentiate between those? Because you commented on emotion being more solemn or more elevated, but then I imagine that it is awfully difficult to define the compound of melodramatic emotion as against picaresque emotion as against what? Yeah. Comical emotion. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite true. And there are not always good conceptual or theoretical tools for describing the different kinds of emotions in different genres. And sometimes they are constituted mainly by the plots that are typical of these genres and even the settings. So in the chivalric romances, you have stories about kings and knights and heroes and castles and the adventures they go on. So it's partly your sense of what emotions are associated with that kind of situation. Whereas the picaresque is associated with the underbelly of city life and the life of thieves and rogues and their experiences. And again, so the sense of the emotion of that genre is the sense of what emotions would go along with that situation and that setting and those character types. How you define them, there are some interesting attempts in genre theory to do that. Patrick Hogan has recently done a study of what he calls universal genres, and he calls tragedy, picking up on earlier research, describes tragedy and comedy as universal genres based on whether the goals of the protagonists are fulfilled as they are in comedy, very broadly speaking, and as they are not in tragedy, very broadly speaking. That comes down to a set of some core emotional goals that humans can be supposed to have, and then you take that and kind of map it to these broad narrative patterns of comedy and tragedy. Once you get into what are called height related emotions and moral emotions, it gets trickier, but there are psychologists out there who study height sort of along a vertical scale. So there are emotions that they describe as elevation at the top and then disgust at the bottom, so they might contrast in that sort of vertical scale kind of way as well. So you can find some interesting resources in the psychology of emotions for attempting to be more exact about what emotions are associated with which genres.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
All right, thank you very much. And well, I think it's time we move on to our last paper, which is by Artem Zubov.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there you go.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say that after listening to those very interesting papers, I think I need to clarify that I came to be interested in cognitive genre studies. So I came to this problematic from the history of literature. So the problems that I am trying to solve for myself are primarily the problems of history of popular literary genres. And so the biggest concern for me is how to try to construct the history of popular genres, paying attention to the anthropological dimension. So how to include readers into the history of the genre. And so my presentation, it will not have cognitive scientific terms a lot. It will be a little bit more descriptive, I guess, in relation to the previous presentations. But anyway, so it is now generally accepted that genres are historically changeable and mutable. The question that interests me most is how to explain historical changeability of genres and readers' ability to recognize them. If genres constantly change, then how do readers understand that they are dealing with the same genre and its modifications, or with different genres? Does historical changeability of one genre lead to the emergence of a new one? And if yes, then how do readers distinguish old and new genres? Should we say that readers can feel when the number of changes reaches the critical point and a new genre emerges from the old? According to the theory accepted within the Russian School of Genre Studies, articulated, for example, in the works by scholar Valery Tupin, genres have stable transhistorical core of characteristics and changeable periphery, which define historical and cultural generic types. Genres in this perspective are only partially changeable. Readers then recognize genres by the stable transhistorical core despite their multiple variations and subtypes. It seems to me that this approach cannot explain how readers interact with popular literary genres, which emerge and develop alongside the rise of global literary market in the 19th and 20th centuries. Of course, these genres do not emerge out of nowhere. They derive from older traditional literary models by creating new configurations of forms in new communicative contexts. Or, as Frederick Jameson put it, the older generic categories do not die out, but persist in the half-life of the subliterary genres of mass culture, transformed into the drugstores and airport paperback lines of gothics, mysteries, romances, bestsellers, and popular biographies. This specificity conditions complex relations of popular genres with sociocultural contexts of their functioning and readers' interaction with generic texts. First, popular genres function as market categories or niches at literary market. Second, they still preserve their traditional generic functions as sets of textual properties. Third, they function also as mental representations that mediate readers' responses to texts. I believe that these three dimensions of popular genres are interrelated, they coexist and mediate each other. As market categories, popular genres are sociocultural constructs or literary institutions that enable communication between producers and consumers of literature. Genres in this perspective are described as subsets of the field of literary production. The notion of the field is borrowed from Pierre Bourdieu's work. Popular genre is a position within a literary field which develops its own logics of regulations of economic and symbolic capital. The genre in this perspective functions as Bourdieu's habitus. Writing in a genre or reading a genre is a social action, which implies that an agent of a literary field accepts certain rules of social behavior and value judgment. This approach to popular genres was offered in Ken Gelder's book, Popular Fiction, which you can see on the screen, and was also applied to certain genres of popular fiction, for example, to science fiction in Andrew Milner's and John Ritter's books. In the context of my presentation, what is important for me in this approach is that popular genres have recognizable social profiles. Genres' existence within the social sphere means that they occupy certain positions in cultural hierarchies. They have what can be called reputation. People know what genres are about, and this knowledge precedes their interactions with texts. This knowledge may exist in the form of stereotypes and social representations. It is often articulated by literary critics and regular readers. It is advanced by market agents in advertisements and commercials. This knowledge is not a fact of readers' individual activity. It is collective, and its existence in readers' minds is not directly connected to their personal reading experience. Textual properties of popular genres are usually described with the notions of generic formulas offered by John Cavalti or generic conventions used in many other works. Conventions and formulas are the foundation of author and reader communication or pact. They are essential so that the reader could understand author's intention. Every popular genre can be characterized as a set of formulas and conventions which readers use to identify a generic affiliation of a text. But generic conventions can function only in the case they correlate with readers' cognitive skills and experience to recognize them and interact with them. To see genres in texts, readers should be able to distinguish different genres, should know their meaning, and have certain expectations based on their individual or collective knowledge. This means that genres are not solely sociocultural constructs and are not solely textual properties. They exist also in readers' minds. Contemporary theory sees genres as mental representations, and this was discussed in a paper by Irina Tarasova and Michael Sinding. In a reader's mind, different genres are connected according to the principle of family resemblance. A genre has a core with foundational generic characteristics and a periphery with characteristics which a genre shares with other genres. According to this principle, a text is always included in several generic classes simultaneously, and every text can be both the best example in one class and the worst in another. I think that in relation to popular genres, we should keep in mind the following questions. How do readers know which characteristics are central for a genre and which are peripheral? How do readers know the right word or generic name, in terminology of French philosopher Jean-Marie Schaeffer, to describe their experience of recognition when they see genres? I believe that this knowledge comes from readers' existence in sociocultural context, where they learn which texts are considered generic and what different genres mean. Generic names of popular genres are given to readers by the market, where they function as recognizable brands. Market creates an illusion of stability of the semantics, which means the difference and change in texts are considered to belong to one category. But at the same time, actual writing and reading practices tend to undermine this stability. Changes in texts and in readers' ability to interact with them shift the meaning of a generic name, which the market preserves unaltered. In my presentation, I will look at historical changes of popular genre of science fiction in the United States, considering three dimensions mentioned above: sociocultural, textual, and cognitive. Changes in these three dimensions are connected. Shifts in the publishing politics of science fiction led to the changes in authors' attitude how to write in the genre. Subsequently, readers had to develop new skills to interact with texts. I will try to demonstrate how genres and readers change together. I think this is an adaptational process. New textual properties and readers' attitudes towards them extended the idea of the genre. At the same time, those new properties are incorporated in the genre as its new defining characteristic. I also want to emphasize that I'm not going to talk about empirical readers. I will focus on a reader implied in text. In my analysis of certain texts of science fiction, I will focus on the level of aesthetics. The question of aesthetics and style are not widely discussed in relation to this popular genre. Scholars tend to focus on thematic analysis or sociocultural functions of science fiction. Stylistic properties of the genre were studied in the 1970s, 1980s, after the publication of works by writer and critic Samuel Delany, which tried to prove that science fiction has its own language and grammar. Although his theory is mostly utopian, many of his observations were productively used by academic scholars. Here on the slide, you may see a list of selected works in this area. In the new Oxford Handbook of Science Fiction, published in 2014, there is an article on aesthetics written by Peter Stockwell. I believe that this is the first handbook of such kind with a separate chapter on language and style of science fiction. So Peter Stockwell suggests understanding aesthetics as a fact that a text has on a reader. In my presentation, I will derive from this idea, and I will try to demonstrate how aesthetic effects of science fiction change within the relatively short period of time from 1940s to 1960s. Science fiction in its early history in the 1920s and 30s inherits belief of realistic literature of the 19th century that the world can be positively explained and described by language. Science fictional representations refer to the world of science from where the genre takes the language to describe the world of future literally as it is or as it will be. Language of scientific discourse, as it seems, does not imply multiplicity of meaning and doubt in its referential qualities. To describe futuristic worlds, science fiction relied mostly on neologisms. Writers and editors believed that every new technology or new idea of imaginary future needs a new word. Subsequently, the more neologisms, which meant more new ideas, a science fictional text has, the better. Back in those days, this used to be one of the criteria to evaluate the quality of science fiction. In texts, those neologisms were always explained since they considered the main source of readers' interest towards the genre. Primary cultural functions of science fiction then were educational. It informed readers about new scientific discoveries and technological advancements, and inspirational. By literally describing non-existent gadgets, science fiction offered its readers prototypes for future inventions. But in the 1940s, publishing politics changed. Editors wanted to expand reading audience and attract new readers who were less interested in exact information about technologies and more in fantastic imaginary worlds. Writers were required to master new literary techniques and learn how to make readers believe that there is a world behind the text. Therefore, readers had to learn how to build those worlds in their imagination. And in my analysis, I want to focus on a fragment from the classical novel by Cyril Kornbluth and Frederick Paul, Space Merchants from 1953, and demonstrate what new skills of reading the text required. So this is the very beginning of the novel. The reader encounters the neologism, depilatory soap, in the first sentence. The word combination, although its meaning can be deciphered from its parts, a soap that has depilatory effect is strange. It refers to something that does not exist in author's and reader's world. It requires an explanation. The neologism produces what literary theorist Dr. Suvin calls the effect of cognitive estrangement, or I guess what Sergey Zenkin interprets as semiotic effect of the fantastic. Its purpose is to surprise the reader, to attract his or her attention, and to make reader wonder about the meaning of the word. But in the next sentence, the estranging effect is neutralized. The scene is given from the perspective of the character, who is not surprised by this encounter. He interacts with it as if it's a regular part of his surroundings. Moreover, reader's attention is immediately removed from the strangeness of the neologism and the unknown thing that it refers to character's thoughts. This neutralization can be called, after Roland Barthes, the reality effect. The detail is shown as if it simply is and does not require any extra attention. In this example, the reality effect is based on the identification of the reader with the character. The detail is not surprising for the character, therefore the reader should not be surprised either. But although the strangeness of the detail is neutralized, its estranging effect influences surrounding familiar words. It creates semantic ambiguity. The effect poses a question whether familiar words have the same meaning in the textual world as in the discursive worlds of author and reader, or the meanings are changed and modified. The text thus invites the reader to figure this out. This ambiguity of meaning is what drives the reader's interest toward the text and what invites to participate in the construction of an imaginary world. The function of the neologism in this example is not referential, it's aesthetic. It estranges familiar words for the reader, making him or her guess what they can possibly mean in this new fictional context. Referential function of the neologism, while it used to be central previously in the history of the genre, here is just an illusion. The actual meaning of the invented word combination has no value for the plot. Moreover, even though the meaning of the neologism can be guessed, it is semantically empty. And this semantic emptiness, I think, can be better seen if we look at the Russian translation. As you can see, Soviet translators struggled with the word. They tried to adapt it somehow to the Russian readers, and it seemed they could not make sense of what a depilatory soap can possibly mean, so they translated it as a depilatory pencil, probably meaning some sort of a small or portable electric shaver. Although this approach towards the creation of imaginary worlds undermined the referential function of neologisms and therefore science fiction's ability to literally depict futuristic worlds, writers kept on using them since they were considered as one of the genre's defining features. They were commonly used to compare science fictional representations with real scientific discoveries. Only in the late 1960s, it became obvious that neologisms are just science with no reference, and that science fiction does not depict or predict future. This realization led to what can be called a crisis of representation in science fiction. Different writers reacted to it differently. And here I want just focus on two examples. So the first example is from Samuel Delaney's short story, I and Gomorrah from 1968. In the story, the author shows relativistic nature of science fictional invented words, which used to be the synonym of the genre's referential power and predicting abilities. In the example, you can see that one word, frelk, within the invented world requires different nuances of meaning for different groups of characters. So I guess you can see in the example, so for one character, it's French masculine, for others, it's French feminine, then in Spanish, it's French masculine again. So for different characters, it has different gender connotations. Moreover, the word frelk is not actually author's invention. It is a slang word, though in the text it functions as a conventional science fictional invented word for a new phenomenon in the imagined future. And the second example. In the preface to The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin denies science fiction of any predicting properties. She claims that a science fictional novel is a metaphor for present, and it should be read as such, not as literal depiction of the future. And in the novel, the plot, main conflict and intrigue are based on the human narrator's inability to understand the meaning of a neologism that refers to some imaginary social convention. The entire novel can be read then as characters attempt to understand the word and its application in different social contexts and failure to do so. Therefore, the neologism that used to be the source of genre's referential illusion here becomes the source of ambiguity and doubts. Readers' interest switches from deciphering new meanings of familiar words to figuring out the meaning of the invented word. And as a conclusion, so in my presentation, I tried to look at the changes within genre and its readers as parallel processes. Despite the shift in the aesthetic functions of neologisms, readers were still able to identify text as science fictional, which means that readers adapted this new aesthetic effect to their previous expectations. But at the same time, this shift transformed how readers should interact with texts and participate in the construction of imaginary worlds. In other words, readers themselves adapted to the new form, which expanded their idea of what the genre is and what it does to them. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks a lot for your presentation. You were quite quick, so we have a lot of time to discuss. And I think I would suggest to start with a couple of questions to Artem specifically, and then we can freely drift into, you know, wherever the conversation takes us. So I see a hand from Peter.
I also think
Please.
that maybe after this discussion and me answering to questions, then Peter Stokvella and Sergey Nikolaevich Zenkin would produce sort of commentary.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. So Peter.
Okay, this is a very specific, excuse me, a specific question to Artem. Thanks, Artem. I'd written down at the top, what have we not talked about? And we haven't talked about economics, and then you talk about economics, so good. I wondered how we deal in genre terms with those science fiction authors who refuse the categorization of science fiction. So I'm thinking particularly of some Margaret Atwood or Doris Lessing or David Lodge or Ian McEwan, who thought he'd invented serious science fiction a few years ago, even some things that Kazuo Ishiguro has said. That there's a sense that science fiction is regarded as popular, trashy fiction, and they don't want to be associated with it. But there definitely are science fiction. How do we deal with the disparity between what authors say they want to be and how publishers want to position them as being a bit more high class than normal science fiction?
Yes.
And
thank you.
how we categorize.
Yes, thank you for this question. That's my whole point, I guess. That when we talk about, I'm not sure about, I do not want to generalize about genres, you know, transhistorically, transculturally, but I was trying to understand several things about popular literary genres. And it seems to me that it's impossible to talk about them with ignoring sociocultural contexts and how writers identify themselves socially and generically, how readers identify themselves socially and generically, et cetera, And to my understanding, so those identities, they exist outside readers and writers' intentions. They just exist in social sphere. But different writers and different readers and different publishers, et cetera, they can participate in using those identities. And when they're using them, those identities, apparently they have some sort of influence on how people aesthetically interact with texts. So, I mean, we can read Ian McEwan's Machine Like Me as science fiction and receive some pleasure from it as a science fictional text. Or we can ignore this and read it as a mainstream or big literature thing and receive a different sort of aesthetic pleasure. Yeah, so those are social frames, I would say, I think.
All right, thank you. There is one more. Sergey Nikolaevich. Yes.
Thank you, Artem. I approve completely your analysis of what you call fantastic effect, except that I call it, I define it differently, but it's another discussion. My question is, if this effect of estrangement in science fiction can be specifically related to this particular genre, or it is just an example of the general effect of estrangement which we can find in every work of art.
Yes, I think it's a general effect of estrangement. What I think is what happens with, again, I cannot generalize here, but again, that's something I was trying to understand about popular genres. I think that a popular genre, in a way, it's a combination or configuration of different techniques, tropes, plots, and imageries that get together at some moments in time in the 19th century. So it uses different techniques that were used in different literary forms. So it's not genre specific. I cannot even say that there is something specific for science fiction that can identify science fiction specifically.
Okay, thanks.
All right, there is a couple of more questions. One is from Irina, but I would like first to read the question from Natalia, which you all can see on the chat. I will read it out loud. Artem, you have chosen a fascinating topic, but it inevitably arouses a question. Why do we speak about science fiction genre, but not science fiction novel genre?
Yes, thank you for the question. Again, I try to look at this problem from the historical perspective. So we can see that at some moment in history in the United States emerges a new configuration of techniques, tropes, and literary devices. And this configuration receives a specific name, or what can be called a generic name. And this name is science fiction. And when I try to analyze texts in historical context, I try to use the same, dictionary, the same vocabulary that was used at that time. So I'm not trying to impose terms that are not original to that context. I'm trying to analyze the context in its own terms. I'm not sure if an answer to your question, though.
All right, thank you. And yes, there is a raised hand from Irina Tarasova. Please. Do you have a question for Artem? Okay, we'll probably circle back to it.
It may just add something to the question about
yeah, sure, absolutely.
Novel.
Just go ahead.
Science fiction. I just remembered something about science fiction novel genre. For example, in the history of American science fiction, it happened, interestingly, that it was firstly published in short stories format, or whatever you can call it, but then writers would republish those short stories as novels by just combining them together. So when we talk about science fictional novel, what are we talking about? A combination of short stories, or so what is a science fictional novel then? This is just an observation.
All right. So we'll within a couple of minutes, I think we will give the floor to Peter and Sergey Zenkin, right, for their comment. I have just a little point I would like to make. At some moment in your presentation, you asked this question: how do they, the readers, know the right words? And I think it's a very basic idea, but I've never thought about it this way, that genres are names, and if genres are names, then they can do whatever any other words can. They can encapsulate larger, concepts. They can fall out of use. They can be used effectively. They can invoke emotion. They can be used figuratively or metaphorically. And then you started talking, and Peter talked about that, about the economic forces, the market forces. And you said that genres are dependent on the structure of the market. And the usage of genre names, if we think of them as names, as words, may be forced by aggressive marketing, or a usage can persist amongst the readers despite the aggressive marketing. And those marketing processes as embodied metaphorical devices that drive meanings of certain words in certain directions. Because linguists always say that language is something independent of, reality, human reality or human context. So this is a very interesting way, I think, to think about that. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, but this is the theory by this French philosopher Jean. So it's his word, generic name. translated.
Yeah, I know, but it just struck me right now. I never, well, again, your talk sort of provoked this line of thought in my head. So thanks again. So should we open the floor to
yeah, I think
Peter or Sergey, and in which order? What do you think? So Peter, or yeah, please. Professors.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I just should say I really enjoyed this. I think that the discussion has been really interesting. The discussion in the chat has been as interesting as well. So it's really good. What I've done is sort of scribble down stuff all the way through that everybody was speaking. So these, as we were talking, I've sort of pinned them to speakers. If anyone would like to respond to them, that would be good. First of all, to Irina, I guess primarily, I do agree, and I think it's really interesting that the developmental literacy in genre is the key to how we understand genre in its adult form. I think much like other parts of linguistics. So, you know, in psycholinguistics, looking at how language is acquired by children tells us about how we understand language at all. And equally in sociolinguistics, understanding how new languages are formed tells us about how languages exist. And so I think the way that children are taught and culturally habituated and develop and understand genres and start to play with genres as well in their own writing, I think is absolutely key. And Irina's work is really interesting in that respect, I think. The second thing I think is sort of feeling, but I do think a big question for all of us is to talk about the place of emotion and emotional memory in genre. So when we read something and think that it's a genre that we recognize the value of the genre, it's how that genre made us feel. So almost all the books behind me on the shelf are science fiction books, because I keep them here at home rather than in my office. I mean, that tells you something about the sense of what I want to be perceived as an academic as well, I guess. But when I go to read a science fiction novel, I remember what it was like to be excited by science fiction as a child or as a younger man. And that excitement is part of the feeling of the genre. I think that's relevant to how we think about the thing that we're reading at this time. You know, so our memory of previous genres like romance or myth or pastoral or tragedy, the feeling of those is going to affect how we read the thing that we now think of as romance or myth or pastoral or tragedy. It struck me as well that, I think I wrote this in the chat, that genres are a sort of foregrounding filter. So if we already have a framed genre in mind when we pick a book up, which we almost always do, because you never pick a book up with no context, then that determines what you notice in the book. So just to take a very simple, crude example of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights from the 1840s, you can read that book very simplistically, either as a love story or as an ideological political story. And if you read it as a love story, it's all about Cathy and Heathcliff. It's all melodrama and striding across the moors and passion and intensity, and that's what you notice. And the most important line in the novel then is, "I am Heathcliff," says Cathy, because that's how you're reading it, as a romance, as a melodrama. But if you read it as a political story, as an ideological story about class and property rights, then you see different things in the novel. Suddenly the relationship between the two farms of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange is the most important thing. And the very first thing that Heathcliff's book to Lockwood is, "Thrushcross Grange is my own, sir." And it's saying, "This is my property, get off." Now, you don't notice that if you read it as a love story. It never occurs to you if you read it as a love story. So the genre that you come at a novel with, or anything, determines the foregrounding permutation, I think, that you have as a reader. That's how our readers, I think. I think we've also got to think as well about the sort of post-textual negotiation that refines the genre. So, you know, I've seen quite a lot of work on reading groups. Readers like we are, or as whatever the opposite of professional is, not amateur, but you know, as ordinary readers. I hate saying that. The people in the world, civilians who talk about books with each other, you know, just normally and don't get paid for it like we do. You know, the people like that are going to talk about a novel in particular with a sort of self-censorship of what they expect their statements are going to be. So there's a sort of sense of your future self, I think, and how you read a novel. So I'm reading a thing thinking, oh, this is really good. I'm going to recommend this to that person. And that's determining the genre that you're doing at the time as well. I think there's a sort of forward anticipation as well. And the last thing, of course, is because I'm basically a stylistician. You know, what I'm particularly interested in everything that we've talked about today is the textual mechanisms, the patterns, the actual linguistic patterning of how a genre conditions what we see, but also how a text nudges us into finding very fine tracks and different routes through genre as well. A generic genre and a specific genre blend into each other in a hierarchy, I think, is really interesting. So, you know, is tragedy the genre, or is the novel the genre, or is the science fiction novel the genre, or is the soap opera science fiction novel the genre, or is the futuristic alternative history soap opera science fiction novel the genre? And the question of the gradation and how they fit together, I think, is also very interesting. That's everything I wrote down, but thank you very much for listening to my rambling thoughts. Very interested in anyone's responses to any of those ideas.
So any comments or questions for Professor Stockwell at this point?
Oh, yeah, just...
Sorry, too many things.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so Professor Stockwell, thank you very much for your comments. I just... a thoughts that came into my mind about how you said that genres determine our reading practices, but then you said you're also interested in linguistic properties and linguistic patterning of text. And it seems to me that there is a sort of conflict between text and genres. So maybe like in previous traditions of literary studies, genres were considered parts of text and like parts of textual properties. But for contemporary genre studies, genres and texts are in conflict with each other. Can it be so?
Yeah, actually, I think Michael has the answer to this better than me in his work on Northrop Frye. So, he, you know, in his earlier work where he looks at Frye, who's, you know, usually regarded as the sort of superstructuralist, the absolute, you know, the inheritor of prop, you know, and in Michael's work, Frye becomes the beginning of a cognitive poetics, you know, of somebody who's thinking about the process and the reading and the way that readers think about text. And I think if you're going to think about the frame that you come to a genre with, and how a text either reinforces or rejects or alters that frame, I think that's the balance is there in Michael's work that he did a while ago now. Sorry, Michael, I've just put you on the spot in answer to Artem's question. That's not really fair, is it?
Michael, are you being okay with being put on a spot?
Yeah, just had to unmute myself. Okay. No, that's fine. It's I mean, it's an excellent question, although I do think the you know, the research and cognition and categorization help answer some of those questions as well, because the part of one's concept of anything, whether it's a genre or, the traditional set of things, a bird or an animal or anything else, part of your concept is your experience of particulars of the thing. So you'll have remembered knowledge of certain exemplars that represent to you what that concept is. And so that's the exemplar level is sort of the most specific level, but then on top of that, there will also be a prototype level. So you'll have an image of a prototype of the typical form of this, whatever it is, bird or genre, etc. And then beyond that, a little more abstract, you have the schema level, which is a sort of level of knowledge of how the thing works, how its parts fit together, how it relates to other concepts. So I think, ongoing research into how categories work give us kind of more fine-grained set of concepts and vocabulary to think about how genres work and texts work, because genres are those prototypes, those summary representations, but they're also collections of texts. And part of our knowledge of genres is the knowledge of the history of how one text influenced another and built into a movement. So it's a little counterintuitive, but I don't think there is any conflict between those two things.
All right, great.
Thanks
for the Tatiana has a question, and then I think we'll proceed to Sergey Zenkin's comment after Tatiana's question.
Thank you. I do not even know if I'd be able to frame my question very well, but I was, thanks for the fascinating comment, Professor Stockwell. What I heard was, what all of us heard, was that genres make us notice things or not notice things. They also condition us, while texts nudge us in various ways. So we can see fairly easily how to describe this work of determinism. But then, as you just said yourself, there's somebody coming to a text or to a genre. How easy or not so easy it would be to describe this freedom of a subject in relation to whether textual structures or genre structures?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I suppose what we're talking about here goes back to the heart of pretty much everything in cognitive literary studies, which is trying to balance up the frames and from our culture with the thing that we're actually in at the time, and balancing those together and how one works with the other and how one influences the other and how we sort of work back and forth, adjusting our schematic knowledge because the text is doing something unusual or different or unique or singular. I think that is the reason why this is not easy, because there's a lot of complexity there, and if that was an easy thing to say, oh, well, here's a formula for it, we none of us would be here. So the fact that it's a difficult and it's a difficult problem in theory, it's unbelievably massively formulaic, is always going to change the nature of that relationship in different ways. I think there's one thing with that's not to say that you can just it's a complete free for all and it's impossible and we should all give in. I think if you read a thing as it is, I think there comes a point where it's legitimate for everyone else in society to say, well, you're just wrong. So I mean, I couldn't read George Orwell's 1984 as a happy-go-lucky, joyful sort of celebration of a 1940s version of sort of a blend of fascism and communism. It'd just be wrong to do that. And there's no question that novel is setting itself up as a political dystopia. It just is. And anyone who argues that it wasn't is just plain wrong. So I think, given that we can say that at one extreme means that we can formulate rules where the situations are more subtle. But it's important to remember that it isn't that whatever you think it is okay. There are constraints, there are rules, there are principles. It's just that when we have to balance schematic knowledge and individual practice, there's a lot of variation. It makes it difficult. It's a terrible answer to you, Tatiana, to say it's really complicated, but that's essentially what I'm saying.
All right, so Sergey Nikolaevich, comments from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me for my voice. We have heard three very different approach papers, but the approach. But I have. I'm sorry. We have heard three very interesting papers and very different by their approach. Frankly, I shouldn't name those approach exactly cognitive. The question was rather the reader's reaction, and this notion is much larger, much broader than cognition. It is not by accident that our discussion turned to the problem of emotional effect of a text. Obviously, emotion is not cognition. And there are another aspect of readerly reaction to the text. It is the identification of its but it seems to be very important for the identification of a genre. I try to provide some very general remarks, methodological remarks on these three suggested by these three papers. Genre is the means of inscribing a text, a work of art, into a larger cultural context. A means of its identification, of its classification, and of its functioning within a certain culture. This culture changes, and its historical variation determines the differences in our understanding of genre. In particular, our very notion of genre is not very ancient. It began to form since the Romantic epoch, when all the construction of the Western literary culture it is of reader becomes the theoretical our contemporary notion of genre differs radically from the classical one. While the classical definition implied mainly is closed text, a finished text, a text. Our contemporary idea of genre is applied rather for an unfinished discourse, which can combine those discourses may combine within a sole work of art, and Michael's paper brilliantly illustrated this process. What is more important, that in the contemporary epoch, that is after Romanticism, in the high literary culture, the idea of genre tends to vanish. Thanks to systems of high literary genres. Genres seems to be reduced to 2 or 3 very general categories as novel and poem. But at the same time, the system of genres persists in the popular genres. This is why Artem's paper on science fiction was very relevant. Like science fiction, that we continue to perceive very strongly definitions of genres, generic definitions. In this case, genre can be studied, can be analyzed within a single work as a structure of reaction appropriate to an implied reader. And we don't pay attention to the empirical readers and to the history of their reactions to works. Another approach was proposed by Irina Tarasova in her paper devoted precisely to the empirical readers. I don't know, should I switch to Russian, Andrei? Should I switch to Russian by speaking of Irina?
No, that's...
Yeah? Okay, I continue in English. So this study of empirical readers and of their reactions to the literary text can be very fruitful. But here we encounter the same danger that all the sociologists in their questionings. That is, the answers of the respondents may be biased by a tradition and in how to say it, an expectation of that they preview of their answers. For example, the importance of novel, their answers to the question, what is the genres that you know, that you engage in reading, can be explained simply by the tradition of the schools. Somebody already remarked it. So that in such inquiries, we must make a correction related to social expectations of our respondents. Finally, I've already said that this was quite satisfied by Michael's analysis of Shakespeare's play, and this way of dissociating the literary text by various generic components seems to me very fruitful, and I know other specimens of its analysis like for Russian literature, for example. What is specifically promising is this approach that is the fact that the analysis discovers not only aesthetic mixture of different generic sources, but their linear unfolding through the text from beginning to end, which can show an inner dynamics of the readerly reaction and by consequently of the text itself. The problem in all this is also the inscription of the text within a larger cultural context. I approve completely Andrei's question to Michael concerning the multiplicity of textual and generic origins of Shakespeare's play, and the possibility to fractionate these origins into much more particular segments and generic fragments. From the moment that we begin to devise a literary text into several generic segments, we fall into intertextual and intergeneric space filled by very small and even imperceptible, we don't know fragments. We don't know even whether the contemporaries of a text would distinguish between them. So for improving this method, they have to make a historical picture of the culture into which the text is inscribed, and to make account of all the whole construction of the whole semiotic functioning of such a culture. So I return to my first remark. When studying genre, even a single genre, even a genre of a single text, we must always have in mind the whole configuration of the culture to which it belongs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sergey. And officially we have 13 minutes to go, but we can do longer, of course, depending on everyone's schedule. And I have a raised hand from Paulina Gavin, or
yeah.
Gavin.
Hi. Yeah.
I mispronounced that.
I just wanted to ask a quick question. Thank you very much for your discussion. And I just wanted to say that I heard at the start that you stated that emotion is not cognition. So I was just wondering, because I see kind of what do you mean by that? Because I would say cognition is how we process and interpret and engage with texts, and then emotion comes as in my view, as a result of our engagement with the text. So how could it be separate from cognition?
So it's a question for me, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I maintain that emotion is not cognition. Emotion accompanies cognition. It may be a result of cognition, but the cognitive process is intellectual by its nature. And in principle, it can be it can pass without any emotion, as we always do. So I think that it is important to distinguish between these two aspects of our experience, intellectual and emotional.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sergey. And I just wanted to say that, but then if you're distinguishing between intellectual process of like cognition and experience and emotion, but then anytime we process some kind of information, it would still be affected, like our understanding of it would still be affected by our emotional previous experience, wouldn't it? So for example, if I have like some bad experience, like if I didn't like the book previously of the same genre, then my perception of it would be affected by it if I experience some emotions in my previous reading, and that just comes with everything.
Yes, I agree completely. When I propose to distinguish between emotion and cognition, I wanted only to say that our approach, our discussion on literary genres is not exactly cognitive. That it englobes only also another aspect of our literary experience, which is emotion.
Tatiana?
Yeah, I had the same question, in fact, and may I press with that a little bit further, because here we are together to discuss, we came together to discuss genre in cognitive perspective, right? And now what we hear from Sergey is that we are not discussing any kind of cognitive perspectives, we're rather discussing readers' reactions, which are two different things. But then don't you think that cognition is a purely intellectual process, unrelated to emotion and unrelated to any kind of embodiment, is of very little relevance in the discussion of literary genre, just because literature is what it is?
I already said that we can read the text and effectuate the cognition of this text without any emotion. And we do it quite often. When a literary text is in question, surely we combine the two aspects, intellectual cognition and the emotional experience. This is why I propose to broaden our definition of our approach and to speak rather of the readers of the whole reader's reaction, that of simply cognitive process.
Thank you very much.
I don't deny. I also want to propose a wider definition of our activity.
Yeah, I'm all for the wider definition. And may I readdress this question to Professor Stockwell? I mean, what would you say about the wider and narrower definitions of cognition specifically?
I suppose I'm caught here by the fact that I've spent the last 10 years writing about aesthetics and emotion, so I can't really get off this hook. I mean, I've troubled myself with this as well. I think traditionally, by which I mean up until about the year 2000, cognitive psychologists would treat emotion as being non-cognitive, and cognition meant some sort of information content or representation. And I think it all comes down to what your model of the unconscious mind is then after that. I think perhaps the way that you square it for me, and because I write about emotional content within the frame of cognitive poetics, and I'm now quite comfortable about that, on the basis that I think, as Sergey said, it's very difficult to separate them out. They accompany each other so closely that one influences the other. I think the formulation I would end up with is to say something like, it's true that you can have an emotional experience, but you can't think about it without representing it to yourself somehow. And as soon as you do that, it uses all of the same cognitive processes that all the rest of your life does as well. That emotion is separate from cognition, but it doesn't matter that it's true, because in practice you can't think about it without turning it into the realm of cognition. That sounds like a sort of theological way of getting off the hook, but that's where I am now.
Yeah, I have a little question for Artem in connection to what Sergey said and partially to what Peter said. So Sergey, in his comment, he said that the boundaries amongst the genres are being blurred, except for the demand for those genre classifications in the popular culture. Is this how you feel about it?
Yes.
Dealing with popular culture.
Yeah, thank you. That actually was my sort of question to Sergey Nikolaevich, because I kind of think that there is sort of confusion between two things. So one, like on the other hand, we have the fact of reception or the fact of recognition in genre. And on the other hand, we have a cultural reflection about what genre is, in what it means for a text to be part of a generic group. And it seems to me that on the level of cultural reflection, yes, there is this idea that to be a high art text, the text should be outside any generic categories, while mass market text or popular text always belongs to any kind of generic category. But to me, this is the fact of cultural reflection, what it means for a text to be part of a genre. But on the level of reception and on the level of recognizing a genre in a text, I feel like, especially when we talk about contemporary culture in the context of mass communication, so because all those names and images and conceptions about different texts and genres are always circulating in the public sphere, so we cannot not recognize a genre within a text. And that is why we have, so Peter Stockwell mentioned this a little bit. So that is why we have those discussions about whether this is a generic text, whether this is a non-generic text, because we recognize, we like readers and literary critics and writers, we always do recognize genres. But on the level of cultural reflection, it is not a very nice thing for a high art text to belong to a generic category. So this is what I'm thinking about it. So just two different things, cultural reflection and the fact of recognizing the genre. But I'm not sure if Sergey Nikolaevich would agree to that.
No, not exactly. I'm not sure that here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we can really research the reception of a text or of a genre without naming it, without finding a cultural name recognizable for the readers of this genre. And when the names are fading, when they're vanishing from our actual circulation, we cannot speak of recognizable genres anymore. This is why the contemporary, the best contemporary researchers of genres, as for example Schaeffer's one, concentrate upon generic names and to try to classify names and to show the process of the cultural construction. The name is necessary for a genre.
Yes, because this is a process of cultural construction, as you said. So the fact of recognizing the genre with the text, it's also a process of cultural construction and also a sort of emotional and maybe cognitive response to a text. But thank you. Yes, there is a lot to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, we have to say goodbye to Peter Stockwell, and obviously to thank him.
Sorry, Andrea. My children are demanding food, so I have to go. And lovely to see everybody. Let's hope one day we can do that.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, especially other speakers and Sergey. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good night. Yeah, have a good one.
Yes, I think that we're out of time, actually.
Yes, we're very close to a close. But Michael, do you have any final comments, or maybe just a summary or whatever, a small comment?
Yeah, I've been thinking as partly in connection with the empirical study of genres and the discussion of popular genres. There's opportunities for finding lists of genres for different reasons and in different institutions, which I think may be, worth someone studying empirically. There is, Netflix is always revising its collection of genres. It keeps popping up suggestions based on what you've seen in the past. It's got its list of genres, and they're usually, sometimes they're semi-formal and semi-familiar, like adventure movies or documentaries or horror movies, but sometimes they're also made up for different purposes. And so I think it may be useful looking at lists of genres in any context and understanding them as categories specifically created for certain purposes, for certain contexts. So it could be that, it could be the system of genres in a bookstore or in a library, or in music services or music stores. And there, again, I think there's insights to be found about how people think about genre categories, just taking into consideration the specific genres produced and how they're understood and why they are grouped as they are and what they're supposed to do. There are these, surprising numbers of genre categorization systems all around us. That's something to consider in terms of cognition and in terms of popular culture. I'd also add, I would have some questions about the relation of emotion to cognition. There's been, I've seen some recent work where there's a push to expand the notion of cognition beyond sort of the reasoning brain into sensation and perception. Perception can be a form of cognition, and emotion, and emotion can be a form of cognition insofar as it evaluates situations. You're in a situation, you respond to it emotionally in a certain way, and that produces an evaluation and gives you guidance about what to do next and what the situation means. And there are other ways of expanding the notion of cognition, because there's always dangers of expanding it too much and that everything is cognition. But I certainly think when it comes to analyzing the arts and how the arts work with the mind, some of those expanded views of what cognition can be very useful, and then you can include those factors in your understandings of what genres are and what genres do. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. we probably have a couple of minutes for some whoever wants to to produce a little comment, or I can understand that yes, most of us are tired, exhilarated / tired at this point.
It's only 1:30 in Canada, so I'm not too tired.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
The genre burdens us. It's the weight of the genre. It's not easy to carry.
Right. Okay, so Artem, since you've engineered this all, maybe you can say a few words, and
yeah, I don't have too many words to say, actually. I just want to say that I'm very grateful for everybody who came to this discussion and asked questions and participated in talking about the genre. And of course, I'm thankful to Peter Stockwell, who left. I'm thankful to Michael Sinding and Irina Tarasova for their very interesting presentations. And of course, I'm very thankful to Sergey Nikolaevich Zenkin for his very insightful and very complex thoughts about genre. And yes, I'm thankful to everybody. Thank you. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Andrei and Anna, the moderator and the interpreter. Thank you very much. So,
all right, we are vicariously thankful and grateful to you. A round of virtual applause to Artem for putting this all together.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're gonna call it today, and we're gonna post the video on YouTube and all the social networks. We're gonna send out all the links, and I think maybe a small list of papers or books that have been referenced.
Yeah, we can do
also
that.
Be nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So all right.
Yes.
So everybody have a good whatever you're having, night, day.
Other time of day.
Yeah, and okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Yeah,
goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Все, всего доброго. Спасибо всем. Спасибо.